Welcome all. We're going to get started because we have a short window of time for these absolutely brilliant discussions that we're going to be having now. And this is really the first opportunity. We've been going all day long. It's been so wonderful and exciting and inspiring. And it's the first opportunity that I've had really to say hello to everybody together and to welcome you to Judeo-Islamic relations and women's contributions to love and peace. I want to say that I hope that everybody has taken one of these because it's such a packed day, there's just not enough time for me to give the kind of introduction I usually like to give, so I decided just to write it all up. So it's all in here. What are the important themes and why? Why do this conference? And basically I'm saying that Judeo-Islamic relations remain very invisible and distorted and mythified and mystified and demonized. And it's time to say no to that. At this particular historic moment, it's especially important. It's always important. And then to ask the question, why? Why has this happened? So we're on a campus where Jews and Muslims are both in the minority and suffer from various kinds of anti-Semitic, whether it's against Jews or against Muslim behaviors, just because people are not educated and or for whatever various reasons, political, geopolitical, etc. And rather than just focusing on that aspect that a lot of our students come here and they believe that Jews and Muslims have been eternal enemies, they believe this, but rather than focusing on all that negativity, which we must address in terms of its historical lineage and how it gets expressed currently, I decided that we ought to begin with a celebration. Let's begin with a celebration. Yeah, because it's always been a celebration between us. I mean, if we think about what Jews and Muslims have created together in the world in every possible arena, philosophy, literature, architecture, on and on and on, this wonderful sharing and the syncretic nature of both Judaism and Islam, and the major roles that women have played in that, which there is wonderful literature on, but the literature is hidden too. So the hegemonic notions have disappeared. The role of women in bringing together intercommunal relations. So we want, I'm going to just to introduce those ideas to open up the conversation, and then that conversation will continue as we move on. Nicole Payan, one of our faculty, has written a brilliant play called The Birthing, about a woman who's a Muslim, a woman who's a Jew, and how they get to know one another in the process of birthing their children. So we're hoping to produce that next year. So this is just opening the conversation. And I just want to thank so deeply all of our presenters for all of the energy and the generosity of time that they have given to this. I'm just so moved and thrilled by that, and I feel so honored and so lucky. And I just want to say, thank you to Shahla Haeri A and Manal Hamzeh, who in this particular panel today will be presenting to you, both of whom are on the board of the Global Women's History Project and give enormously of their time and generosity and their inspiration. It's through conversations with them. I am so thrilled to finally be meeting Arlene Dalafour, whose work I've heard about for so many years, and to learn about Jews in Iran, how lucky we are to have her with us today. And Tirzah Firestone is for me one of the greatest inspirations on this planet. So I feel totally honored and blessed to have her here today and to know her and to have her in my life. And everybody in this room is a profound inspiration to me and has really shored up all of the efforts to make these kinds of programs happen. So let's keep them going, and thank you so much for being here. Please pick up one of these. There's a sheet on the goals of the Global Women's History Project. Go to our website, globalwomenshistoryproject.com. for the information and the conferences that we've had before and who's been at them. And we have a wonderful blog. We'd like you to participate in the blog, give us your responses to everything we're doing, your questions, your suggestions. And also, please be sure to pick up a thank you sheet. It would take me too long to go into all the people I want to thank for making this possible. So I wrote it out in a sheet, and please honor them by reading that, taking that with you. I'm going to introduce one of our interns, Gabi Camacho, and she is going to introduce our first speaker, Manal Hamzeh.
Hi, everybody. As co-president of the Global Women's History Project, it is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Manal Hamzeh A. Just a brief information about her. She is currently a professor at the New Mexico State University. She teaches women's studies there. A lot of her classes are anti-racist, decolonizing educational studies, Arab Muslim feminism, and homosexuality in Islam. Her most recent book that you guys can actually pick up outside is Revealing Pedagogies. And now, with my pleasure, here is Dr. Manal Hamzeh.
Hello, everybody. I am humbled to be around everybody today to continue the conversation in this conference. I will not take much of your time, but I am, as Elise had given me the space in this conference, I want to just bring out some of what I've learned in my visit to Cairo last December, and at the same time, maybe open a space for some questions, whether we get to them or not. I want to tell you first why I went to Cairo last December. Since the revolution of January 25 started, I was torn. I wanted to be in Cairo. Cairo is the soul of the Arab world. I learned my first lessons about revolution. I learned my first lessons about women in history of the Arab world in Cairo. And my family has a history in it. They lived in exile in Cairo. So I wanted to spend and begin my fifth decade in Cairo with the hope that the Egyptian had given me as an Arab last year. So of course I went to Tahrir. And Tahrir is the square in the heart of Cairo. And Tahrir, for some of you who might not be familiar with the word in Arabic, means liberation. And that square that we maybe have seen much of it represented or representing the January 25th revolution has been the revolution space since the beginning of last century. It's not a new space where people go and express their demands. Basically, if you take a look at Cairo here, this is a picture taken from the Cairo Tower, overlooking that building that is burned is the old party of the Mubarak regime that was burnt during those 18 days. And behind it right there, there's a brick kind of color building, is the National Museum of Egypt. And right in front of it is the space that we call Tahrir Square. So for me in that visit, it was, I wanted to walk where the revolutionaries walked. I wanted to be able to feel, not only see how people channeled into the middle to make their voices and ask for the downfall of Mubarak. I wanted to learn how those 18 days happened. I cannot capture everything, of course, so I decided to talk to anybody that I encountered. From taxi drivers to vendors to demonstrators who were sleeping in the square in tents, to activists that I've gotten to know, or my friend who hosted me, Nadia Kamel. She's a filmmaker. And I'm bringing her up particularly at this point because her mother is one of the remaining Jews in Egypt. And it's just a little vignette about that because that is relevant to the conference. Nadia made a film that took her about 5 or 6 years about the complexity of her mother's identity. She comes from a Jewish family that is Christian Italian, but married a Muslim, did not really become a Muslim, and all her family that was Jewish or is Jewish moved out of Egypt when most of the Jews in Egypt were forced somehow in the mid-50s to leave to another diaspora. So I am bringing that up because she was also celebrating with Nadia the 25th of January revolution. I learned lessons from people. Yes.
What is your background? Jewish, Arab?
I'm a mixture. I bet I'm a mixture. I'm born to a Muslim family that is not religious. Okay? What I have learned mainly from Nadia, because she walked with me throughout Cairo, telling me stories to every little question I asked her, and she would take me back to history and then to the present and back to those 18 days. And I would like to share with you just a few things that I've learned from Nadia. That because people ask me here, since I am in the US mainly, were women in the revolution, what was their role? Women were in the forefronts in all shapes and forms, from all classes and all sects of life. They were sometimes on the side because they wanted to be able to move differently than men. But she was trying to explain to me that in those 18 days, people were not gathering in a way that was hierarchical, front, back, middle, or up, down. So it was not the answer to that question, were women there? They were there. How were they there? I had to listen to 100 stories to understand how women were there. I learned from Nadia that also apparently the fans of football in Egypt had formed more or less a political movement against neoliberalism and against modernizing soccer, and they became a powerful force within the 18 days to gather people, to write slogans, to chant every day. And this meant that most of the people think that fans of soccer are troublemakers. They were very politicized, very, very nonviolent. I also learned that it is impossible for me to continue to understand what is happening in Egypt without going back, basically, to our feminists, what I call Arab Muslim feminists, including Nawal Saadawi. Nawal Saadawi is in her mid-80s, and she was in the middle of Tahrir. So I wanted to also trace back this revolution to the labor and the activism of women over 100 years in Egypt. And I just want you to know that that I also learned that there was different kinds of art being played in the revolution and after the revolution, continuing to make sense of those 18 days and the changes that were happening daily there. So there were young people who were playing music and making songs every day. There were people making graffiti and speaking back to the power that was blocking them from seeing what is behind, let's say, this wall where the police was getting organized to run them and attack them in protests. They subverted and they have redone this wall to show that they are peaceful, they see beyond, they have a vision for this revolution. They had graffiti everywhere on the walls of Cairo, at least wherever I was going. I don't know if you all also saw in the end of December, I had already left Cairo, where the revolutionaries and the protesters who were peaceful were attacked by tear gas, and women were lynched. And we saw an image, I think it was spiraled on Western media, of a woman lynched, thinking perhaps she did use a long veil, but she was stripped and we saw her a blue bra. So the Egyptians, I don't know, men or women, and I don't care, they're speaking back the language of exposure that the military regime had tried to humiliate them with. They're speaking back to it. And this means there is no the revolutionaries are not going to accept humiliation or shame. Because bodies of women, and we all know, have been contested in revolutions and wars, and patriarchies and militaries have fought over women's bodies, and they thought they could humiliate Egypt, which is a female, like I assume Iran is a female. They could humiliate all of Egypt itself, by humiliating a woman and lynching her. So they're speaking back with their art to that militarism and patriarchy. And I don't want to go too long and take more of your time, but this visit, though it was short, and of course I speak Arabic and I read it and I am able to...
What does it say?
It says, this first one, the red, is no, and the underneath it, no to the nakedness or the exposure of the people. So I left Egypt. There were 5 or 6 intense days for me, and I kept questioning myself, how am I going to be able, as a teacher, a professor, how will I be able to teach revolution and have the revolution teach me? And I am still cooking a course in my head that I would like it to be in connection with the Egyptians on the ground, using their tools that they have used to topple the beginning of the regime, the top of that regime. So I follow several people on Twitter and on Facebook to continue to understand every day what is happening. And I want to do that with students so that we are there learning with them and from them. And the question to me is, how can we continue to learn the revolution so it does not become history, a history that is forgotten? And how can we learn the revolution that includes everybody, and that a revolution that is connected to everybody? So it's also, for me, that revolution is connected to the, if we're talking about the recent revolution, the uprisings and the demonstrations in Iran in 2009, and the Occupy movement here. So in some ways, if we are talking about the intersectionalities of identities in this conference, of Jews, Muslims, at least in this today, how do we continue to ask the questions where we do not lose sight of the intersectionalities of people's experiences that become part of their identities, that they're always changing? How do we do that by connecting to other people with the new technology? How do we do that in our classrooms? How do we do it in our scholarly work? And I leave you with that because I have, of course, this is a big question for me, and I'm trying to find ways to unpeel it, because there's no answer to it, through my teaching. And I thank you for listening.
We're going to move on to the next speaker, and what I'd like you to do is just to take a moment and jot down some questions or thoughts that you have based on what Manal has just shared with you. And we're going to have time later in the evening. We're in a little bit of a crunch because we have an honorary degree ceremony, as you all know, coming up at 5 o'clock. So just take one moment now. And I also, while you're doing that, wanted to just comment on Manal's talk. Thank you so much, Manal. That one of the goals of Global Women's History is, of course, to archive women's history. And that's what Manal is doing. And I'm just constantly in awe of her courage of going into whatever situation is required in order for her to retrieve that history in all the different ways that she has the enormous talent to do, and how lucky we are to have that, and how much that helps us achieve our goal of archiving women's history. And the second point that she made, which she made many wonderful points, about Nadia's mother, one of the remaining Jews in Egypt, which for me, pointed to the whole history of Jews in Egypt as revolutionaries, as bringing social justice movements, as shoring up social justice movements in Egypt, and it's a beautiful history. And so thank you so much for having that beautiful image of her there, which is also one of those histories that's getting lost. And then the other pieces, of course, that she reminded me of is that the Global Women's History Project takes a very strong stand against militarization of the state, militarization of the world, and war. We take a very strong stand against any possibility or thought of war against Iran. We are all about retrieving and celebrating those traditions of intersectionality, which are about the loving and peaceful ways that people really want to survive together on this planet. That's what we all really want. So it's not an easy struggle, but with all the wonderful work that everybody's doing, I think it's possible to make it happen. So having said that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Shahla Haeri. Dr. Haeri was born and raised in Iran. She is a professor of cultural anthropology at Boston University, where she has served as director of their Women's Studies program. She does research in Iran, Pakistan, and India, and writes about such subjects as law and gender dynamics, focusing on the Muslim world. She is also an author of several books, including No Shame for the Sun, Lives of Professional Pakistani Women, which is in its how many reprints? For her work, she has been awarded many fellowships, including a fellowship from the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. Shahla is also a filmmaker. She has shown her film, Mrs. President, Women and Political Leadership in Iran at Westfield State University. It's one of the most popular films among our students, and is on the board of the Global Women's History Project. Please welcome her.
Hello, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be back here. Can you hear me? I think I'm too short and hidden behind this. Before I go on to my own talk, which incidentally I have called it Humanizing the Queen of Sheba, we just heard Arlene quoting an African poet who has said something to the effect of, culture humanizes people, whereas politics demonizes people. So I thought it was very apropos of what I want to talk about in this talk. But before I go on, I want to say, thank you to Dr. Elise Young, and how much I have always enjoyed being here and meeting new people, and particularly the Iranian community. It's always a pleasure to meet many Iranians here as well. But we've been talking a lot about identity and how our identity is multifaceted and interconnected. And it forms the very core of our identity and our being. But we all know, having said what I just quoted from Arlene, that our identity, our very being, blossoms, gets a chance to develop when we have peace. So please say no to war. Now, this project that I'm going to talk about, the Queen of Sheba and women's political leadership, is a very new project for me, and I have just started doing research on that. And so my ideas are very tentative and speculative. And given that the fact that the time is short, I'm going to go very quickly and rapidly over what I have prepared for you today. Now, I was thinking of asking you, do you know the Queen of Sheba? Or if you do, what do you know about her? But given the fact that the time is not short, please just keep that in mind, and I would love to hear about you, what you think or what you have learned about her. Now, who is this fabulous woman? She, she has been a leader, she has authority, she's beautiful, and she has been recorded in all the Abrahamic religions, all the sacred books of the Abrahamic religions, and that's what we have been talking here today. But strangely, she's not named in any of them. We don't know what her name is. But popularly, we know, Jews and Muslims know her as Bilqis or Balqis or Bilqis, you know, the variations of the name. Now, of course, we hear nothing or very little about her parentage through the sacred books. So who was this woman? Where did she come from? How did she get to where she was? Now, the medieval Jewish, can I just turn this, put this down? The medieval Jewish and Muslim sources have written extensively on the Queen of Sheba and on her parentage, even though there is nothing in the sacred books. Now, they often talk about her natural or supernatural pedigrees. Muslims believe that her father was a king of Yemen, and this man happened to be, in some of the sources, he happened to be on a hunting trip where he comes across two big snakes, one black, one white. He kills the black snakes, and through that he releases the curse that was placed on a princess genie. So she happened to be the daughter of the king. The king is very happy. In gratitude, the king gives the princess genie to this king of Yemen, and the king of Yemen is very happy to marry with her. And by the way, in those days, jinns and humans could see each other and intermarry for love. Now, 9 months later, of course, the beautiful Bilqis is born from a jinn mother and a human father. Now, realizing that she has a mother, I imagined her having learned magic and insight from her mother and authority and power from her father, to the point that when her father dies, being the only child, she becomes the leader of Yemen. Of course, the stories are diverse, but I'll just stop at that point. So she becomes the Queen of Sheba, and it is at that time that Solomon hears about this beautiful woman, very powerful, very authoritative, and controlling this fabulous and prosperous land. But before I go on more to tell you a little bit about her and her dramatic encounter with Solomon, I want to tell you how I became interested in her. Now, it was wonderful that Manal came before I did, because I have become interested in women's political leadership. Of course, women have always had political power, but often they function from behind the scene. I am interested in women who've actually moved to the public domain, in front of the political power and have actually achieved political powers. And they have become heads of the governments, by which I mean someone like Benazir Bhutto, a modern prime minister, or a 13th century Indian sultan, or the Queen of Sheba. So in this, I am interested in this whole idea of women and political power. And as Manal talked about, the very recent exhibitions, manifestations of women and power in Egypt or in other Muslim countries, I'm going to take you way back in history talking about the Queen of Sheba. So several years ago, I was going around, and in one of these conferences, I saw a book that was called Demonizing the Queen of Sheba. And I immediately bought the book, and I thought, who would want to demonize this wonderful, beautiful, gracious, powerful woman? And for what sin? What has she done that needs to be demonized? So, what is interesting, I realized that the fact of the matter is that her political authority and power is acknowledged in all the sacred texts, the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians. So that by itself confounds the political leaders, the patriarchs. What to do with that? The fact that women have been acknowledged to have power, yet in real life, women are not supposed to be in the public domain as a political leader. So, and of course, how do they describe this amazing dramatic encounter between the Queen and Solomon? So infinite variations of the story is being told, and as the story, as it has moved in history, it has taken cultural sensibilities and historical specificities. So what I want to do today is to tell you how I think that the Jews and Muslims have actually understood it, Muslim women have understood, and Jewish women understood this story, and how is it being interpreted in the medieval Jewish and Muslim texts, not in the sacred texts, but in the commentaries on the story. Now, it seems to me that if, from the Jewish versions of it, this woman goes to visit Solomon, arrives at his court, has this dramatic encounter with her, wishing to learn wisdom. The Queen of Sheba, according to the Jewish version, was in search of wisdom. She had heard so much about Solomon's wisdom and intelligence and justice that she wanted to see it for herself. So her quest, her desire was for learning, understanding, and watching the functioning of wisdom and judgment in practice. And what is interesting, again, in the Jewish version, for her to really understand the wisdom of the king, she would put a lot of riddles to him. And he had to respond to these riddles. And those riddles are everywhere, and you can find them. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go to that. But it tells you how smart this woman was in trying to really find out the wisdom of the king for herself. But of course, as we realize that later on, Jews do demonize her. Now, in the Islamic version, I argue, it seems to me, that this woman had a desire, was on a mission for peacemaking, because she cared for her people. She was loyal to her. She was loyal to her people. She wanted to prevent Solomon from attacking her people and destroying her idyllic society. But as I mentioned, this is not how the Jews and Muslims have portrayed the story and have made commentary on that. So how have they done it? How have the Muslim and the Jews demonized the Queen of Sheba? And this conversation that I am going to have now is based on a story by Jacob Lasner that I mentioned earlier on to you. For the Jews to demonize the Queen of Sheba, they had to think of her as not being a woman. They assume her to be, they portray her as being a supernatural being who's really not a woman, but her intentions are to kill babies in their cradles. So presumably women, powerful women, are either having supernatural powers or nefarious intentions. So for the Jews to demonize her, they talk about the fact that she is a woman who she is not supposed to be. In other words, she has transgressed against the divine scheme for gender role, gender hierarchy, and gender relations. She's not married, by the way. Remember, Queen of Sheba was not married. She was a virgin beauty. So in that sense, they demonize her as a woman who has nefarious intentions. For Muslims, again, this whole idea, the fact that she is mentioned in the Quran, and there's a big story about her in the Quran, and it's a positive, more or less positive view of women and leadership in the Quran, they had to contend with that. They had to find a way of demonizing her, and while at the same time acknowledging the fact that she's been mentioned in the Quran. So what do they say? They say that this woman was also a supernatural being, the sign of which was her donkey-like hairy legs. So she had hairy legs, and she had this donkey legs. In other words, she had this supernatural or unnatural characteristics, which then allowed her to be in the public domain. But I think in both cases, we can think about her sin for which she was being demonized from the Muslim and Jewish patriarchs, is that she had transgressed against the divine law by assuming political power. In other words, her sin was the very act of political leadership and sovereignty itself. She was not supposed to be a political leader. So then the way that Muslim and Jewish sacred texts, as I said, have confronted these sages with ambivalence about women and political leadership. In other words, even though the Muslim and Jewish sages try to appropriate the persona, the character of Queen of Sheba, at the same time, they have to admit how smart she is, how intelligent she is, how graceful she is, how powerful she is. You know, it's a very ambivalent relationship between women and authority and the very fact of their power. In both versions, she's ultimately forced to either have sex with Solomon by force, I mean, you know, almost is under the threat of rape, or to marry him, or to marry one of his underlings. So while the Queen of Sheba's creative power and sexuality is appropriated, she gets to return to her homeland, though shorn of her authority and power, and formally in the face of it. So what I argue in my project is that if we take a snapshot view of the encounter between Solomon and Queen of Sheba, we realize that she's being shorn of her power. But then if you take a long-term view of that, if you take that as a process, the fact that the queen gets a chance to go back to her own country gives us a chance to pause and realize that, first of all, these guys have ambivalence about women and power. Second of all, she doesn't lose her power. She just gets to go back, and from then on, as I said, she might move from behind the scene because now, you know, the situation has changed. And you'd be interested to know that she, when she gets to go back to Yemen, Solomon, to prevent her from getting into power, sends another jinn to go with her so that the jinn would prevent her from getting into political power again. But we may ask here, you know, we may ask here, and we may wonder here, that, well, Muslim and Jewish sages should have known to begin with, this woman was partly jinn. No, the jinns would have very much liked to be helpful to her rather than preventing her from getting into power. So it's all these contradictions and ambiguities and ambivalences that come through this narrative of the Jews and the Muslims. And seriously, if you really read the story, which I don't have time to do it as much, you realize that how much resentment is there against this woman's political power. The sin for which she has been demonized is the fact that she has been a sovereign power. So this discourse of power and might that is reproduced through retelling of the story reaffirms the differences between the gender. That's what the traditions are trying to do. Here are the women, here are the men. That's a woman's identity, that's a man's identity. This highlights gender identity and hierarchy, male domination and control, and as I said, not without ambivalence. But then again, as I said, this narrative of might, that is to say the male might, is simultaneously tempered once we follow the Queen of Sheba back to Yemen and view the story as an unfolding process rather than a snapshot of a moment. And by the way, I have to tell you that the story has a very interesting version of it in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian versions of it is quite different, and Lasner in his book doesn't even refer to that. So, just almost to end that, the story doesn't end when the king and the queen bid each other goodbye. It follows the Queen of Sheba to Yemen. It's an ongoing dynamic. It's a process of mutual, or shall we say, the process of mutual appropriations. That is to say, women want to get into power, men trying to prevent them from getting into the power. So the challenge of political authority remains for both genders. As again, we saw in the Egyptian ways, women are trying to be pushed, but being humiliated, you know, primarily through their bodies and sexualities. And the moral of the story, this Queen of Sheba, which the formal moral of the story is that only kings, meaning men, ought to appropriate and dominate, and that's backed by formal force. So as I said, if we follow the queen to her homeland, we realize that she cannot rule as a political leader as she used to before. She might quietly, ever so discreetly move from behind the scene and continue to her activities very discreetly until an opportune time to emerge as a queen on the scene again. It happened in the 11th century in Yemen when Queen Arwa, also known as the Little Queen of Sheba, became one of the longest reigning rulers of Yemen. That is to say, she ruled from 1067 to 1138. And apparently at that time she felt neither guilty nor allowed anybody to make her guilty. And of course we see that again happening in Yemen when Tawakkol Karman was given the Nobel Peace Prize. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a path for women's and political leadership. If it is not well trodden, but it is a path. And there are patterns for which women can take and appropriate and then re-emerge on the political scene. Thank you very much.
We do have a little time now for questions and discussion. So, let's see, how would we like to do this? Why doesn't anybody who has a question to ask just raise the question to either Shahla or Manal? Yeah.
I just, your whole representation of the Queen of Sheba was so fascinating because it reminded me of the story of Lilith.
Yes. Well, that's what they say. I didn't mention, but of course that's what the Jewish version of it, she's actually a Lilith.
Ah, okay. That was my question. Was she supposed to be?
Yes, she clearly refers to, and Jacob Lasner deals with that quite extensively. She's referred to as Lilith, and that's why she has all these nefarious intentions towards young kids, infants to be pregnant.
Okay, because in the story of Lilith, it was represented that that was the original first woman created by God, and then she transgressed and so was punished by becoming a demon, forced to become a demon, and then Eve, the good woman, was created for her, who would accept her place. But of course she didn't die.
Partly because Lilith didn't obey, didn't want, as the first woman didn't want to obey the husband. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's part of, eventually when I write, I only have 20 minutes. So if I had more time, I would have talked about that, but that would be eventually part of the project.
Well, very fascinating talk, and you alluded to the Ethiopian variety, which I'm somewhat more familiar with, and just to add to that, it's much more legitimating. Indeed, Menelik descended from this union of. So it's not the scary parts of women are pretty much absent. But the other part that you might find fascinating is that the Ethiopian, let's say, genealogy of power is often traced to Sudan or to Nubia, Merowick in particular. And there you find multiple cases of regnant women, not just periodically, but frequently. I can give you their names.
I would love that.
And they're called Kandake or Kidiko, the royal woman, and that gets into the Bible as Candace. It's corrupted from the Merowitic word.
But some people argue that Makeda, as she's called.
Makeda is descending from that tradition. Anyway, I just wanted to share those. I'll speak with you more if you like.
Yes, I would. There's only one point I'd like to mention. Lasner makes this, I think, assumption, which I challenge, and I don't think is quite right. He assumes that, or maybe others, not maybe Lasner, who compare the Ethiopian versions to the Islamic version. They assume that in Islamic versions, the women are rendered totally powerless. It's not quite correct. In fact, she's perceived to be quite agentic and aware of what she's doing. So, but then, you see, the Jews put more emphasis on the gender transgression or gender hierarchy, the transgression that is happening in that sense. Whereas for Muslims, it is a matter of conversion. It's a matter of, faith that is the problem. So it has nothing to do with gender.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I think that for the Nubian case, or Sudanese case, this is pre-Judeo-Christian. It's not an Abrahamic tradition. But then to be absorbed by Makeda, who is probably a corruption of this Candace or Kidiko, then she is a Coptic Christian, so it's also quite different from the Muslim.
I would very much like to talk with you after that. Yes.
Good evening, Manal Hamzeh A. I'm interested, how do you see her? As more of an African or Arab? because Haile Selassie directly said he was a descendant of her. So I'm very interested on your opinion.
Well, you see, I started reading Lasner first. Then I only knew about Force, because he doesn't even mention, which is very amazing. It's a fantastic book. So then I had to go to Hebron, I guess, and do that. And then I've been watching some films. The BBC has a very nice productions about following women. And then I started writing the Queens of Sheba. And I thought, no. It's one queen. Variations. You could have her as Ethiopians. You could have her as Arabs. You could have her as Jew. You could have her as Muslims. Just think how powerful and fantastic this story is in terms of, as I said, understanding our common humanities and interconnectionness. So then I dropped calling her the Queens. And in my bigger paper, which I just presented in Virginia, I was there, in fact, 2 days ago on Monday, I gave a 50 minutes presentation, so I had more time. I presented as one person who may go to Ethiopia or to Arabia, but no one really knows. So I played with that. And at this point, I don't want to assign any identity or nationality or ethnicity to her, or any race, because I think she's one for all.
I just wanted to add, and that's directly in relation with what Luana said. Even Jamaicans, Jamaicans, the last Africans, to be precise, claim her because they're followers of Haile Selassie, who they call Jah, descendant of the Queen of Sheba. So it just does something to their pride to belong, to be descendants, or to be followers of a descendant of the Queen. So of course the rapper is the African, but that kind of it depends how you see, her.
So exactly. For that matter, it would be really reducing that magnificent character into just one nationality, race, or identity. Yes.
This is actually from Manal, but I want to thank you for that mythical, very deep mythical character who plays so many roles and has so many faces. I want to come back to Tahir Square if we can just for a moment. What you saw in December, there's been so much that has continued to unfold on that square, and both progress and regress. It sounds like and looks like from your pictures that there are still people on the streets now and their own Occupy movement. Can you speak to what's happening, what you saw now?
Remember that was mid-December. The tents that were there in front of the parliament and the prime minister were taken away by the police, and then the police attacked the protesters and killed many of them. So so Tahrir Square and the areas around it were cleared, and after a while, and after lynching the young women on the street, they cleared the protesters. And then I started to think there are many Tahrir Squares happening all over Egypt. And that means our focus was not on the Cairo Tahrir Square. And those Tahrir Squares were already alive from the beginning. And actually they started in Suez, okay? Which is known to be it's the city that the revolution started in, not Cairo. So it actually, when they cleared with all the blood, of course, and the killing and shooting, they made me look at other spaces that are Tahrir Squares all over Egypt. So this is a revolution that is alive, and it's in flux. And it is not taking the physical space anymore as its a stage of action. They are, for example, there's this campaign called No to Military Rule, and they have their own slogan, and they have it with graffiti all over, but also they've made video discs and distributed them all over Egypt, and people are just projecting them on buildings. So Tahrir is on buildings, Tahrir is everywhere. In the universities, because the protests are in the universities also, and basically we should not forget that the factories all over Egypt, textile factories, have been always, from at least in recent history, from 1998 until 2011, they were the site of like sit-ins and protests and closures and all that. So the factories, the schools, the universities, and the squares that are built in many places in Egypt as places where people can assemble and speak of and do democracy. So it has changed after, and it will be always changing. But the space is big. The space is very big.